And I will start sharing my screen. Okay, from the beginning. Ontario butterfly counts. What have we learned in 25 years? Well, I've been involved with Ontario butterfly counts for even longer than that. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. Butterflies and me go back a long way. In fact, when I was about 12 years old, I started collecting, and I became quite obsessive actually with collecting them. I had not just butterflies, but all sorts of other insects. In fact, I was so obsessive that at one point my father, he said, "James, I think you are getting a bit too obsessed with these butterflies and insects, so I want you to stop collecting for a week." And so I did. I stopped collecting for a week, and I was in agony with that. But at the end of the week, we were at a picnic, and I saw this cicada, the first I'd ever seen. So I climbed the tree, got the cicada, came down, and my dad was there, and I just showed it in his face. I said, "The week's over." So that was how passionate I was. So I go back a long ways with butterflies. Now, the butterfly counts are quite an interesting thing. The first I'd ever heard about it was about 91. And some friends of mine who were down in the Long Point area, they told me they had this butterfly count that I should come and participate with them. So I did. So there was Peter Carson and Mary Gartshore and Don Sutherland, who many of you may know of. And this was just a blast. I just thought, wow, this is fun, going out all day and hunting butterflies, identifying them. And so I thought, hey, let's start one in my area. So I did. I'm in Durham, north of Oshawa. And so I came up with a circle, and the butterfly counts, they're all 24 kilometer diameter circles, similar to the bird count. So I picked an area across the Oak Ridges Moraine that I thought would be pretty good, have a range of habitats, and invited a bunch of people along who I thought were either interested in butterflies or knew their butterflies well, and we broke up in parties, and it's been going ever since. So this was one of the early butterfly counts. We used to have a picnic at the end of the counts, and we did it at our place for a while. Now we do it in the restaurant. Then in the northern part of Durham, we have this area where there's a rail trail, and I discovered there were Baltimores there, and we didn't have Baltimores in the southern part of Durham, so I thought that was pretty exciting. And there was this rail trail, which was just amazing for butterflies. So I started another count there. So we called it the Sunderland count, which is a small village really that's within the circle, but it's a much bigger area than that. And that was, we really tried to capitalize on this rail trail, which runs kind of north-south through this circle. So I've been running those two counts for 25 years. Now, I know Bill mentioned that there's a Hamilton count. I think there's two in the area. And butterfly counts are done in a similar fashion to bird counts. In fact, they borrowed the criteria and the procedure very heavily from the bird counts. So same size of circle, the same idea of groups going out all day and counting all the butterflies that they can see, and then compiling all the data, and it all goes to a central data source, which is the North American Butterfly Association. And it was originally run by an organization called the Xerces Society, but then it got transferred into the NABA, which is the North American Butterfly Association. They're based in the States, in New York, and they all these counts. And there's about 400 counts in North America. In fact, there's also some in Mexico as well as Canada and the US, but the bulk are in Canada and the US. So in Ontario, this from 2019 that showed where all the butterfly count circles were, apart from one in far northwestern Ontario. Now in 2020, we actually had a bunch of counts were canceled due to COVID. About 10 or 12 of them actually didn't take place, including Hamilton, which was a shame. Most of the other counts did carry on, but it shows you the kind of the distribution. It'd be great to have a few more covering some of the areas where there are gaps, but it does give a pretty good cross section. Really would be great to have more coverage in Northern Ontario because a lot of different species up there, which we don't get in the south. And so I compile all the data of all the counts. So it all comes to me. And so this is just a little summary table that shows the counts that were done in 2019, the number of species, the individuals, where they are located, and all that goes. Not all the counts actually contribute to the North American Butterfly Association, but all the data does go to the Toronto Entomological Association. So the areas there, like I mentioned, in the circle, 24 kilometers in diameter. If you've done bird counts, you know how hard it is to count the birds in your area. Well, you can imagine butterflies in the summertime being much smaller and having small territories. It's really impossible. But anyway, we do the best we can. Parties go out, try to cover the range of habitats that are there. And we are managing to get enough data that is useful for comparative purposes. Now, butterflies are very weather dependent, as you may know. They really like sunshine. And the day of the count, if it rains, you might as well throw in the towel because there won't be any butterflies flying. And even if it's heavily overcast and a cool day, there'll be virtually no activity. If you've got a heavily overcast and very warm weather, there still will be quite a bit of activity, and it's still worth holding the count under those conditions. But generally, the amount of sun is going to really help improvement. So that weather makes things a little difficult to compare from one year to another, because if you have one year with really ideal conditions, the next year it's marginal, the numbers will be quite different. The idea is to go out there, cover the range of habitats, and get numbers of good representative numbers of what's in every particular area. Now, when do you hold the counts? Because not all our butterflies fly at the same time. We have, for example, early flying species like the Arctic skipper, which is out in early June and kind of finishes by mid-June. And then the hair streaks mostly come out in July. So how do you have a count that gets everything? You have to at least consider all of species. And then there are some really early flying species like the elfins, such as the hoary elfin, and then a few late flying species. In fact, the Leonard skipper is really the only butterfly that only flies in the late summer, but those two species are hardly ever counted on any of the counts because they're really at the two ends of the butterfly season. Now in the States, in the southern states, some of the counts, they will have actually 3 counts. You might have one in May, one in July, and then one in September, where you have a whole range of species and many with very restricted flying times. Here in Ontario, our butterfly season is shorter, and there aren't as many species at the two ends of it. So we basically try to do the counts at the time of year when there's the majority of the species, or at least most of them, and that is July, early to mid-July, when most of the counts are done. Now the season, how early the spring is, can really influence the butterflies. For example, I use this photo of a red-winged blackbird because to me that's the harbinger of spring. When you first get those red-winged blackbirds, spring has arrived. But if you get an early spring, the butterflies are going to emerge earlier. And if you get a really delayed spring, then they're going to come out a lot later. So even if you have that count on the same date every year, the numbers could vary just because of the seasonality. Now, butterflies, they all have to overwinter in one way or another. Some of them, like the Baltimore butterfly, it overwinters as a caterpillar. And it emerges when the conditions are warm enough in the spring and its food plant is out, then it will come out. And so you can imagine if you've got a cool spring, that process, the food coming out and just going through the wind stars is going to be much delayed, and the butterflies will be out later. Some of them, like hair streaks, they overwinter as an egg. The butterflies lay their eggs on the base of like oak trees, and they emerge as the leaves are unfolding, and then they'll be out in July. And then other butterflies like swallowtails, this is a pupa of a tiger swallowtail. They overwinter as a pupa, and they, again, the heat of the spring will trigger when those butterflies come out. And of course, holding an account, you really are dependent on good people that know their butterflies. So what I really try to do nice to get as many teams as we can. Some of my counts, I get up to 10 parties going out. I'd really like to have at least one person that knows their butterflies pretty well on every team, because good eyes, it's easy to miss things, and butterflies can be tricky, particularly the skippers. Now, 1/3 of all of our species are skippers. So a lot of, many of you are probably pretty familiar with white admirals, red admirals, monarchs, painted ladies. The skippers are the real challenge, and that is where we really need some experts who are able to tell the different species. Is not only being able to identify the species, but it's also finding them. And then you got to count them. So how do you count them? This picture here was taken on the Halliburton count a couple of years ago, when there was just a super abundance of European skippers. We had over 25,000 European skippers counted on that count. If you look at this photo, every little orange speck you see there is a European skipper. And it's a challenge, because I know some participants tend to underestimate, particularly skippers. They just kind of go out and they say, oh, well, there must have been about 100 of them. But if you really start counting, there could have been thousands of them, which certainly was the case on this day. And really, it's important to cover a range of habitats. Like I mentioned, butterflies, they like open sunny conditions. Some of them like the drier kind of meadows, and others prefer moist. So covering a range of habitats is really important in trying to get a good count, because really what we want to do is get all of the species that are in that count area. How many species do we get? Well, the Sunderland count is one of the highest numbers of species of any of the counts in Ontario. In fact, one year we had 62 species, which was only tied this year by a count in Ottawa. And so most counts should be able to, with some pretty good effort, they should be able to get at least 40 species. So getting counts of 50 and more, that's pretty exceptional, but can be done. And you can see we've done it quite consistently in Sunderland. Now, the numbers of individuals, here you can see the fluctuations. I'm using the Sunderland count as an example. And I've got two colors on this graph. And the one are the total number of individuals, and the other one are the native individuals. And the reason I separated them out, of course, we're more concerned about our native species, protecting those ones. And we have two non-native species, which can be super abundant. And you can see in the years 2003 and 2008, how those numbers, and the real common one is the European skipper. They can be 80% of all the butterflies in the count can be European skippers. And notice in 2012, we had a high number of native species and very few of the non-native ones. Here's the European skipper. When they're in their peak, well, I just told you about the Halliburton count. Well, they can overwhelm. You walk through the fields, if the count happens to hit their peak, which is fairly short. It might be hard to find some of the other skippers in among the mass numbers of Europeans. But how do you actually compare from one year to another? Because I told you how big those count circles are, and there's no way you can really count them. So the way that we compare them is by the number of hours of field effort. And so, for example, if we've got 10 people out in the day and they all are out for 5 hours, then that's 50 hours of field effort. And then we can look at that in relation to the number of butterflies that were found, and then we can get a relative number of individuals per hour of field effort. And that's what this graph shows right here. So you can see how it fluctuates quite a bit. These are the two counts that I compile, the Oshawa count and the Sunderland count. And so you can see it goes anywhere from about 15 butterflies per hour to well over 100 butterflies per hour. Of course, European skippers are one that factors into that. If you've got a lot of European skippers around, you'll get over 100 per hour. But it is really important, that data. So the counts, they also record the number of kilometers that are walked in the field and even by car, but those numbers aren't really that important. What's really important is the number of field hours, because that's easier to to document as well. I find that naturalists in the field, they tend to vary. Some overestimate the number of kilometers walked, others underestimate, so it's hard to get that, but it's a lot easier to keep track of the number of hours that they're out there. This shows the most abundant butterflies in all of the counts in Ontario. I've taken all of them. You can see that European skippers are, by far the most common butterfly on counts in general. And then as you go down, then as we get into some of the less common species are much less than 1 per hour. Now the North American Butterfly Association, they keep track of all of the counts and the numbers, and like the birds, they keep track of which count actually has the highest numbers. And so we, in the Sunderland count, we have really high numbers of eyed browns. We've had the all-time North American high count. We also have the all-time North American high count for tawny edge skippers. And one of the interesting things is how things can vary from one year to another. Now, I think in this area, eastern-tailed blues are very common pretty much all the time, but in Sunderland, they're really not that common. They're not rare, but generally we were getting an average of about 12 per year. And then one year we had 395. And so where did all these butterflies come from? So butterflies, of course, they have this tremendous power of reproduction, as all insects do. And so they're able to adapt to new conditions, or, why did the species suddenly decline again, getting back to about 12 per year after that 1 year? Was it disease? Was it some other factor, weather? A lot of mysteries out there. What I find is some of the bigger conspicuous butterflies, we get better data on them. And the reason is because even the butterfly counters that aren't as experienced, they will easily identify monarchs, tiger swallowtails, red admirals, some of those. So because what I find is an experienced group, they might have a lot more skippers, but they'll probably have about the same number of monarchs as a less experienced group. So those numbers, those common conspicuous species, we probably have better data that we can compare from year to year than say for the skippers. And monarch, of course, is a butterfly that has a lot of interests. It's one of our species at risk, and we've all heard about the massive declines that we've seen. But you can see how the numbers can fluctuate from one year to another. And something really strange happened this year. I don't have 2021 on here, but we actually had pretty high numbers of monarchs on the count, and yet something happened later on in the season because the numbers of monarchs migrating south was pitifully low. It was just about the lowest I've ever seen, even though in the early part of the season, there seemed to be really good numbers of monarchs. So I haven't yet seen what's happened to those monarchs and why they suddenly declined. Typically, the counts are done in the early part of the summer when the monarchs, they're not at their peak, but this year it seemed to be, that was the peak, and they just declined from there. Very strange. I can't see a show of hands out there, but I like to ask this question. How many generations of a year do you think that monarchs have? So I can't get the input, but is it 2 to 3, 4 to 5, 6 to 7, or 8 to 9? Well, the answer is 4 to 5, 4 to 5. It's always, of course, a big mystery, isn't it? How the monarchs are able to find their way back to those wintering grounds in Mexico when there are so many generations removed. Now, red admiral is another species that's a migrant, not as well known as a migrant as the monarchs, and they don't concentrate the way monarchs do, but they are migratory. So all of the ones we have here, they will move south in the fall and come back. They have several broods, just like the monarch. So what I've done is taken the data from three different really conspicuous species and just see how they compare. So we have the monarch, the red admiral, and the white admiral. The white admiral is not a migrant, it's a resident butterfly. And what you really see apparent on this graph is how the monarch and the red admiral can fluctuate so much from one year to another, and yet the number of white admirals per hour doesn't change really that much from year to year. We have the white admiral and the red spotted purple are a really interesting group. They're the same species, two different subspecies, and you probably know of them in this area. And in Durham, the white admiral is far more common than the red spotted purple. So basically, if you're not familiar, they're the same species, sometimes called the banded purple. The white admiral is a more northern one, and the red spotted purple is a southern, more or less Carolinian species. And as you get south, you won't have any white admirals, and once you get into central Ontario, there will be no red spotted purples. And in the Durham area, what's interesting is we have almost consistently, we have about 10% red spotted purples for white admirals. I think in the Hamilton area, it might be close to 50-50%, but it is interesting how consistently we have seen this pattern throughout the years that the count has happened. So that's, I think that's pretty interesting. Tiger swallowtails has presented a real challenge to us because there are two species and the way they're recognized has been changing. Now in the Durham area, we typically didn't get the summers later, the tiger swallowtails later in the season about 20 or 30 years ago, but now we are. So it seems that they have moved north. So we have the Canadian tiger swallowtail and the Eastern tiger swallowtail. The Eastern tiger swallowtail being a more Carolinian species and the Canadian being a northern species. The Canadian one is much smaller. But then we have the second brood, which seem to be midway in characters between the Eastern and the Canadian swallowtails, midway in size, and some are thinking it might be a third species, or they're actually hybrids between the Canadians and the Easterns. So that's kind of an ongoing thing. That's research is going on. We're finding new things about the tiger swallowtails. But they are a conspicuous butterfly, beautiful one, of course, and one that is easily picked up by participants. But distinguishing between those two, and if we have like our counts in July, in Oshawa, or in in June, when you could still have the earlier flying Canadians as well as the Easterns or midsummer, whatever they are. So that's been a bit of a confusion. Another one that's quite confusing for participants is the crescents. We have the pearl crescent and the northern crescent. The pearl is a more southern one. The northern is a more northern one, but they're both in this area. And you can tell them by, if you look at the row of dots on the hind wing, there's a line above it. And in the male, if the line is continuous, it should be a pearl crescent. And if it's broken, it should be a northern crescent. But these two show pretty clear pattern, but in the field, you get just about all integrades, with some have just a little gap between that line and others have no line whatsoever. And so that one, we know that the numbers that are coming in on the pearl versus the northern crescent are not really going to be that accurate because you just don't get a good enough look at them. Having the experts out in the field is great, especially if they cover the same areas from year to year. They get to learn where the spots are, the good locations, not only for big numbers, but also for the specialist species. Like we have a number of species like the mulberry wing shown here, which likes sedges, and there's about 5 species of skippers that are pretty much the only place you're ever going to find them are in these sedge marshes. So you have to hunt those sedge marshes out, spend a bit of time, look for flowers in the sedge marshes to hunt down those real specialist species. There's always some surprises on it. The hickory hairstreak is rare in Durham. We had one just a couple of years ago. That was the first one we ever had on that count. And we had another surprise on the Sunderland count last year, which was the Atlantis fritillary, a more northern species. This was the first record for Durham region. And a couple of years earlier, in 2007, we had the black dash, and that was the first for Durham region, which we had on the Sunderland count. Then a couple of years later, we were finding a number of black dash. This is a southern species, which you do get regularly in the Hamilton area, so maybe some of you are familiar with it. It's a sedge specialist. This is from the Butterfly Atlas, and Here's our Durham area. These are all recent records. So in fact, our count circle is here. Most of these yellow squares that you see are coming from our Sunderland butterfly count. And then we had a couple of other recent ones. But previously, the range of the black dash was considered to be just pretty much the edge of the Carolinian zone. You can see there's a few recent records up here as well. So there certainly is one of the real beauties of the butterfly count, apart from getting all these data that we can compare, it's just getting lots of people out in the field with intense search effort, and they find things like the black dash. The butterfly counts have also documented the expansion of some other southern species moving northward. These are two examples, the Delaware skipper and the Dion skipper, that were basically Carolinian species that have moved further north, and now they're well up into the Shield country. In fact, I had both the first Delaware and the first Dion for the Halliburton count and different years, and they've been found considerably further north than that more recently. So there certainly are some exciting things. Giant swallowtail, one of my favorites. It is a species that has also experienced quite a bit of range expansion. It feeds on prickly ash, and it's really expanded in Eastern Ontario, in the Kingston area, and even in the Durham region, we don't have very much prickly ash. It's a pretty rare plant, but in the later part of the summer, we tend to see these giant swallowtails showing up. Now, they don't show up in too many of the counts because the second brood, which is in August, is when they seem to be a lot more abundant than in the first brood, except in the more in the Carolinian areas, like down in Randall and places like that. And this shows the caterpillar and the pupa of the giant swallowtail. You probably get them quite commonly in this area, I imagine. Here the counts have real specialists. This one is the mottled dusky wing, which regularly is found on the Rice Lake Plains. It feeds on New Jersey tea, and that's the only count in Ontario that regularly gets them. We have another little skipper called a dusky, a dusted skipper, which is only in the pinery area. So they regularly get dusted skippers, but no other counts in Ontario get those skippers. So counts have been pretty useful in documenting where some of these species are. And one of the exciting things, just like with birds, when you're on the bird counts, what's more exciting than getting a vagrant bird or something that's rare? And so there are quite a few southern butterflies that occasionally show up on our counts. Bill was talking about the pipevine swallowtail earlier. Here you can see what it is. It's a southern butterfly that they show up more regularly down around Point Pelee and Rondo, but we've even had one on our Sunderland count one year. There's cloudless sulfur, fiery skipper, and variegated fertility, and other ones too. We've got another trivia question for you here. How many butterfly species do you think occur in Ontario? 100, 120, 140, or 160? And again, I can't see your hands. Some of you may know. It's close to 140 species of regular occurring species. Now that's all Ontario, going right up to the Hudson Bay lowlands. So it doesn't include some of the Arctic types skippers. And then we also have about 25 vagrants, which show up very, very rarely. So white M hair streak. Now in the years of butterflying, 2012 was the most unusual year. And we thought we might see more years like that, but it has not happened yet. If you remember that year, that was when we had an absolutely crazy warm March. March was like almost like May, for not just for a couple of days like you get some years, but for several weeks. And so what happened that year is it's the only year I ever ended up having to do amphibian surveys, like frog count surveys in March. The flowers of apple trees were like a month earlier. And so we just had this really prolonged period of warmth, and that stimulated things like we hadn't seen before. For one thing, the winter was very mild, and so there's a very high survival rate of red admirals in the southern states. And in the spring, we had this massive movement, like millions, literally millions of red admirals. I remember one day I was driving on the 401 going around London, and there were just red admirals flying across the 401, all just as I'm driving along. And then later that same year, we had these other butterflies were showing up, like rare things, like the dainty sulfur is something that might show up once in Ontario in 10 years. One butterfly might show up. In 2012, they had established temporary colonies. They were breeding here. And there were several other species that normally we don't get, and they actually started breeding for that 1 year. Common Buckeye is another example of a southern species. It's a migrant that comes up, doesn't usually return, but they don't overwinter in Canada. And most years, a few of them show up on a few counts in the very most southern part of Ontario. But in 2012, they showed up on 75% of the counts. And here you can see the number of counts that they were on, as well as the number of buckeyes per hour in the count. So, and then after that, you can see how few buckeyes generally we get. So another example of 2012, the amazing year. Because all of those ones, like the dainty, they never showed up again after 2012. We have a new butterfly to look for. You may have heard about this. It's called the European common blue. It just was first accidentally introduced into Quebec, I think at 20, not quite sure the year. But anyway, they've started showing up in Ontario, and Toronto had the first ones on their count in 2020, and they had them again this year. Haven't heard of them anywhere else yet in Ontario, but it's one to look for. Quite a pretty looking butterfly. Is it going to become a pest like the European skipper, or is it going to be kind of a fairly benign introduction? Feeds on not crown vetch, but bird's foot trefoil, which is a non-native plant. So hopefully it won't get into too much competition with our native ones. A little bit about butterfly habitats. I mentioned they like sunny conditions. So forests are not particularly useful, not particularly favorite habitats. So when the Europeans came to North America and they cleared a lot of the forests, changed them into pasture land, they actually were doing a lot of butterflies a favor. They really created a lot of butterfly habitat by accident. Now, hayfields in themselves, you can have good numbers of butterflies. They don't typically have a lot of species, but a lot of this farmland got abandoned after it was determined it wasn't so productive. And so during that successional phase, a lot of butterfly habitat. In fact, even gravel pits, they can be pretty good butterfly habitat because there's kind of dry areas, wet areas, and kind of maintains open conditions. So human disturbance can be very beneficial for butterflies. In many cases, many places, there's probably a lot more butterflies now than there would have been in the, say, 1700s. Here's an area where you can see we got some wet meadow in the bottom, and then it gets dry up the slope. Great place to go looking for butterflies, whether you're on a count or just looking to see what you can see. Wetlands, sedge marshes in particular, you've got the specialists, and wherever you get flowers in marshes, sedge marshes or just meadow marshes, really good butterfly habitat. In the Sunderland count, I mentioned that I started the count really because of this rail trail, and we found all these butterflies, these massive numbers of butterflies in the first few years of the count. But as time went on, we found the rail trail was not so great anymore. And we were wondering what happened to the rail trail. Why wasn't we not getting massive numbers of butterflies that we did in the early days? And what really the reason was because of succession. So when we started the count, that trail was a pretty new trail. The railway had been pulled out. There was a lot of open areas alongside of it, but over time the shrubs moved in. There still is some habitat. It's still not bad, but just a shadow of what it was. The first couple of years we had really high numbers of columbine dusky wings all along the rail trail. Now we're lucky if we ever get a columbine dusky wing on the count. And it's all about succession. So even when we leave habitats to let them go naturally, they will eventually not become good. So we really need some kind of abandonment. And that's where if we have really dry, like very dry, naturally dry conditions like oak savannas or alvars, those are naturally good butterfly habitats that remain open. Or if you have like marshes, meadow marshes, where the trees are too wet for the trees, those are naturally good habitats. But those mesic areas are very transitory. They will eventually grow up into non-habitat. Great thing about butterflies is they fly, they're very good flyers, and so they have really good rates of dispersal. And when new habitat is formed, they can show up pretty quickly. And one of the sad things that's happening, which I know is happening in this area, is where we lose habitat. This was a air photo of an area that I covered on the Sunderland count in 2005. Just look at this. We got this wet meadow in here. We got these hedgerows. This was just a great spot. All kinds of butterflies through there. And what happened? Well, you can guess what happened. The farmer decided that he needed more cropland. So he basically ripped out the hedgerows, put in tile drainage, and completely wiped out a large area. So take a look again. This is the way it used to be.
Sorry to interrupt, James, but you're cutting out once in a while.
Oh, okay. Are you, how do I sound now?
That's good.
So hedgerows along cropland, you will get some butterflies there like admirals, but generally it's pretty limited in what's there. One of our real big problems on with butterflies, which probably no mystery to you, are the invasive plants. And we are really seeing the decline. I've noticed on our counts, particularly the skippers. The skippers, apart from the Europeans, and in fact, even the European skipper numbers have really been going down in the last 5 or 10 years compared to the earlier years of the counts. And what I've noticed too is on the Southern Shield, like places like Halliburton, Charlotte Lake, and Perry Sound, places like that, those are really great butterfly habitats. Like those are better really than south of the Shield. And I think the invasive species is a big reason for that, because now the dog strangling vine in particular, you go in the Rouge, like the East Toronto count, the amount of dog strangling vine in there is seriously affecting the butterfly numbers. So much for the negative. Butterfly counts have had a really positive effect on getting people interested in butterflies. I know I really promoted our counts with our Naturalist Club and getting new people out every year and really getting a lot of interest. I'm sure Bill is doing the same here in Hamilton. It's a good learning experience. Great when we can get the younger people out, families out to get their kids to learn about butterflies. Of course, some of the new people, maybe they'd rather go out for a half a day than devote a whole day of intense butterflying. That's fine. Even I encourage people to come out, even if they could just come out for a couple of hours, take them out to one good spot and then give them a taste of the butterfly count. And the counts have contributed a lot into our knowledge of distribution. We contributed a lot to the butterfly atlas, and now, of course, there's iNaturalist, where a lot of naturalists are submitting their observations. But the butterfly count, the butterfly atlas, which is organized through the Toronto Entomological Association, they are getting their data from eButterfly as well as iNaturalists to create this map of the distribution of all of the butterflies in Ontario. And just learning more about where butterfly habitats are within our own areas, the counts have been very useful in that regard. And particularly, as I mentioned, for the more conspicuous species, the North American Butterfly Association, they have really looked at monarchs and red admirals in particular, and again, relating the number of hours of field effort and documenting how the numbers fluctuate from one year to another. Ontario has actually done quite amazingly well on butterfly counts. We tackle them with the same vigor that bird counts. I found that a lot of the other jurisdictions don't seem to do as well, and I'm not sure what the reason is. Ontario or the rest of Canada has not done very well. The prairies have a few counts. They had quite a few years ago, and they seem to have lost interest there. I've not seen any of the counts in BC or the Maritimes. And even in the States, a lot of the counts are only a couple people go out for maybe 5 or 6 hours, get 30 species or 20 species. A lot of the Ontario counts are getting 50 species. even more than they're getting further south. And it's not because we have more butterflies, it's because we have managed to get more people out in the field. And so I think that's really important in educating people and getting out. Like here, actually, this is a picture of Alberta. One year, Alberta had more butterfly counts than any other jurisdiction. And then after that, they seem to be very few. I don't know what happened there, but something happened. My last trivia question for you. I often get questioned about moths versus butterflies. And you probably know the difference. But how many more butterflies, or how many more moths than butterflies do you think occur within Ontario? We know there's more moths. If you have a light at night, you know there's going to be more species of moths than you ever see butterflies in the day. But how many times do you think? 5, 10, 20, or 50?
James, I'm going to say 20.
Okay, well, you're right on the mark there. You're right on the mark. There's approximately 20 times as many, roughly 3,000 species. That's a lot of moths. And so what I do, I would encourage you to get involved with butterfly counts next year when you get the chance. Hopefully Bill will be running his count again, and sign up and get your area. If you don't know butterflies too well, get out with an expert. And even if you don't participate in the counts, they're really a fun group of organisms to get to learn because they're out in the sun, nice, good weather. There's some really distinctive species, and it's pretty exciting when you see a new butterfly. And it's contributing to, this is a citizen science way of contributing to our information about butterflies. They're easier to document than the other insects, so we have much better data on how the numbers are doing from one year to another. So with that, I will open it up to any questions that anyone might have about butterflies, or at least about butterfly counts. Okay, I guess I see in the question and answers a few ones. Okay, the first question is, are pipeline swallowtails rare here because of how few people know about the plant, the pipeline? So the pipeline swallowtail is a more southern species. The plant pipeline is not native to Ontario. So its food plant is only here where it's been planted. And so occasionally they have been pipeline swallowtails that have moved into Ontario. They found the pipeline, which is sometimes planted on people's porches or in their gardens. And occasionally there are temporary populations of pipeline swallows in Ontario, but generally they are much further south, like they're in Pennsylvania, south, and getting them in Ontario. Most years we don't get any, but I know that one year that Bill mentioned, there seemed to be this real influx at Point Pelee. All the times I've been back at Point Pelee, I think maybe one time I'd seen one pipeline there, but that one year there were like dozens of them. Oh yeah, I'm quite, okay, Susan said 6 to 7 generations. I think that relates to the monarchs. So you know the answer is 4 to 5. It goes, do you count moths? Well, moths, butterflies are quite hard to count, as I mentioned already, but moths would be virtually impossible to count in that way. Now, there's so many more species of moths, the identification is a lot more difficult. I do run a moth trap, and I've been doing quite a bit of it this year. I've had several hundred species of moths just in my yard. Gives you an idea of how many species there are, but many of them are really tiny with these little micro moths. And actually we are doing a project where we are, it's a relative count. So it's a site where we set up a moth trap about 5 times over the summer, and we see how many moths come into the trap, count them, identify them, and then we're going to do this in a similar manner over a number of years, and we're relating it to succession to see how the numbers of moths change in relation to the succession that's happening there. But that's pretty exceptional. Generally, I've talked to some other people that do a lot of moth trapping, and because the number of moths that you get in the trap overnight can be overwhelming. So just being able to identify them, let alone count them. And then plus we don't know how far the moths are coming from to the trap. So it is much, much more of a challenge. The butterflies, at least they're out in habitat in the day. You can see where they are. You can get a pretty good sense of where they should be. So much easier to count the butterflies. Okay, we have a question from Rosemary. Does each group in Ontario hold their butterfly count on the same day in any given year? The counts that I do, the one in what we call the Oshawa count, I usually do it the weekend before Canada Day. And the Sunderland one is the weekend after Canada Day. And I know that East Toronto count, they do their count on Canada Day every year, and they never change that. But usually they try to get the same weekend, either a Sunday or a Saturday, when people aren't working and they can get a larger number of participants. Sometimes what happens is we'll have a rain date. So if that first day gets canceled, I might have to move my count 2 weeks before I can get it done again. And so I've had to do that a few times, because if we get a rain day, then we'll cancel it. But generally, the counts try to get pretty close to the same day in every year. And that makes the numbers more comparable from one year to another. All right, that looks like the questions we have, unless anyone wants to, can they open their mic or not?
James, no, they can't open their mic, so.
Okay, well then that looks like the questions and the answers as best as I could answer.
Okay, well, that was great, James. A real good synopsis of butterfly counts. And, some of the things you mentioned, it got me thinking, and I wrote some notes here. You were talking about white admirals versus red spotted purples.
Right.
And I'm not even sure if they were always considered different subspecies. I don't even know if they're considered subspecies now. They might just be considered forms within the same species. Because I know on the checklist for E butterfly, they're no longer separate.
Was that okay?
But it does make sense in a way, because I think it's just one gene that is possibly, or there could be a few genes involved in it, cause the expression of whether it becomes a red spotted purple in appearance or whether it looks like a white admiral. Because I know in a brood from one red spotted purple, you can get white spotted purples appearing.
Okay.
You had mentioned. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what is the ratio here?
Yeah, the ratio here is, I mean, the Hamilton area is a big area. I mean, it's a 40 kilometer diameter.
Yeah.
But I would say the ratio is 95% red spotted purples.
Okay.
And 5% white admirals. And, in the north part of the range, we would get more white admirals than in the south part of the range.
Yeah, yeah. So it does show you, I mean, it's interesting what you say about the genes, and yet there's this very clear line, because if you get up on the Shield, there's no red spotted purple whatsoever. If you get down to Long Point or Point Pelee, there are no white admirals whatsoever. So there clearly is
yeah.
Even though maybe genetically it doesn't seem like.
But it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I once had a red spotted purple east of North Bay, like along Highway 17. So, and I think if you look in the butterfly atlas, there is the odd record of red spotted purple that far north, which seems very odd, but it does occur, I guess. A couple other things too. Giant swallowtails, that harkens me back to when I started looking at butterflies in the 80s, mid 80s. There were no giant swallowtails in Hamilton. Mm. And I remember writing an article on finding a giant swallowtail at 50 Point Conservation Area on Lake Ontario in 1986. And that was kind of the first one. So it seems it would be kind of odd for somebody who's getting into butterflies now to think that at one time giant swallowtail was an extreme rarity to even the Hamilton area. And mottled dusky-wing, we do have a population of mottled dusky-wing in Hamilton. It's been well known for years. I'm not exactly sure how well it's doing. There's a lot of secrecy behind it, the populations, where they occur, because there still are, unfortunately, people that would collect these butterflies, even though they're endangered. And you talked about, you're the first person I've known since Alan Wormington who talked about 2012 and what an incredible, exceptional year it was. And it was kind of like, well, this is going to be the future with global warming, maybe in, how many years, pick the years, when it's going to happen. And I think a good term that I heard, that everybody heard this year for the first time, was what settled over Southern Ontario in March that year was a heat dome.
Okay.
The word, but the term wasn't coined then, because it was this mass of hot air. And because it was so early in the season, it didn't cause the problems that it caused in British Columbia this year, where, temperatures got almost up to 50 degrees there. But here in, it was like the latter half of March for, I think it was almost 7 days to 10 days. We had temperatures in the high 70s, even in the 80s consistently. I mean, it was spooky.
Yeah.
But it set in motion all these things that came later in the month. I remember seeing saucer magnolias flowering in late March when they normally flower in the first week of May. And you talked about that year, that incursion of red admirals. I think it hit Hamilton, the Hamilton area on, I could be wrong, but I think it was April 15th. And you can almost mark the hour. It was around 5 o'clock in the afternoon when all of a sudden we were inundated with red admirals, and to a lesser extent, question marks. And the interesting thing about question marks, on that date, that was record early for the province. And yet I'm looking at my car after I watched a soccer game on that day, and there's a question mark sitting on my car. It's like, what's going on here? So, yeah, and I remember that day going out into the park behind my house. There was pears in flower. Of course, they shouldn't have been in flower at that date. It was probably 2 or 3 weeks early. And they were just covered in red admirals fighting each other. And, you consider butterflies kind of a day flying creature. These guys were going up until dusk flying around. Like it was something I've never seen before or since. And the Buckeyes that came into the province, especially the variegated fritillaries, how abundant they became. And getting on to something more recent, the European common blue, there was a record for the Hamilton area. The Hamilton area being centered on Dundurn Castle, this 40-kilometer circle we have. Bob Curry found some. He meticulously was looking for them, knew the food plant, realize that they occur in kind of junky areas, really, or can occur in areas that that are cut, where there's going to be a lot of, under pipelines, that type of thing, where there's going to be a lot of bird's foot trefoil. And sure enough, he found Hamilton's first European.
I think it's just a matter of time before, in 5 years we probably won't be so thrilled about them. But
no, you're right. But at least it's
yeah.
But at least it's a very nice looking butterfly. It's I won't say it's a welcome addition, seeing it's an alien, but it's going to be a lot nicer looking at than European skippers.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's going to impact our other blues that much. I mean, even something like a eastern tail blue is almost like a weedy species now, as it is really feeding very commonly on planted alfalfa. So, very interesting situation. Let me see if there's any more questions. I see Just a comment, excellent presentation. And I have to say, I very much concur with that, James. I know my butterflies pretty well, but I learned quite a bit from your presentation tonight. There were times where, just so you know, there was times where your voice was trailing off a bit, not because of you, but because of some technical glitch. And when you would, but we could still hear you. It just became softer. And then when it was like the paragraph was done and you spoke again, the volume came back up to normal. So I don't know what was causing that glitch, but it was just a minor thing.
Okay, you know, one of the things I've got my son, he's a drummer and he's down in the basement, but I have on the other end of the house is closer to the router. And so it might do with me being farther from the router, because I know.
Yeah, you weren't completely cutting out. You were just becoming quieter.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
I very much thank you for coming tonight and giving us this excellent presentation, a good synopsis of what butterfly counts are all about and what's happening with butterfly populations vis-a-vis invasive plants. And yeah, thank you very much for coming.
All right. Well,
and I'll get the Hamilton count going again in 2022. COVID kind of, we could have run it this year, but we kind of chickened out, but we'll definitely get it going for 2022.
Yeah, the way that I've done my counts and the other ones I participated in, like we've always had a tally in a restaurant afterwards, and so the tally was out, and I didn't meet people in the morning. I just said, okay, through email, here's your area, just cover it, give me your data at the end of the day, and so that's the way a lot of the counts that still ran.
Yeah.
They didn't have in-person meeting; they just did it all.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's another option.
Yeah.
Great to have you do it again. And certainly if you learned something, because I know you've been in butterflies a long time and you found a lot of really great stuff. And so if you learned something, hey,
yeah. And do you remember that time at Point Pelee where you pointed out the pipevine swallowtails at the tip?
Yes. Yeah.
I'm not sure what the year was. It must have been in the early 90s, I think.
Yeah.
But I really have no idea.
Yeah, and I've never seen that. I can't, other than like I think I've seen once another one. So it was just a fluke. Just it was just there at the right time.
Yeah,
it was a real movement at that point. Just like
yeah, and as a sort of a segue into the bird study group meeting next, planting for wildlife. I planted pipevine. Dutchman's pipe. I planted it in my yard when I first moved into my house in '94. I like the look of it. I mean, the flowers are not at all showy. They're interesting, but they're not showy. But I planted it strictly for enticing pipevine swallowtails to come to my yard. Now it took me so 1994, I think I had my first occurrence of a pipevine swallowtail in 2000. I think it must have been 2012. I guess it must have been that great butterfly year. I had a couple visits. One laid eggs. The eggs hatched. I was watching the larvae. They were sort of communal larvae, half a dozen of them all together. And then one day they just weren't there. I guess they got eaten by a wasp or something. And then it wasn't until this year where I had another one where I was sitting outside working on the computer, and I noticed a butterfly flying slowly up against the Dutchman's pipe, the Dutchman's pipe. And I said, is that a pipevine swallowtail? So I got my net and caught it, and sure enough. And my son was at work, so I caught it and I put it in the fridge, in a jar in the fridge, so that he could see it when he got home from work when I released it. So it just goes to show you what you can attract to your yard.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I've had a similar with the giant swallowtails, because I planted and like the prickly ash basically doesn't occur in the southern part of Durham. There's like none of it. But I planted a prickly ash patch, and it did really well in my yard. And I also planted a couple of hop trees. And every year in the late summer, I would see 1 or 2 giant swallowtails. But then, not this year, but last year, I found all these caterpillars on both the hop tree and the prickly ash. But very late in the season, like so late, I even took quite a few of the caterpillars in because I thought they're not going to make it. It's so late in the season. And I raised them to pupas, but none of them emerged, and I never saw any the next year. So they did not survive that winter, it seems. So
Yeah, I see. Interesting.
but certainly planting that prickly ash has really brought them in, just like your pipeline. So butterflies seem to be able to pick up this scent of plants from. How do they do it? Because they must pick it up from miles away.
Yeah, it is pretty amazing. Yeah.
So a lot of mystery, a lot of things we don't.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks once again, James. That was very good of you to speak to the Hamilton Naturalist Club.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
And for club members out there, I guess the next BSG meeting is coming up, and you've got the information on the next HNC meeting. Hopefully our last Zoom meeting. I mean, Zoom meetings have been good in the sense that at least we've been able to gather in this format, but I'm of the opinion that, it's much preferable to gather in person. So hopefully we'll be able to do that in the new year. So stay tuned for that. So good night, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Very good questions there. And, as I've always said, I'm open to feedback. So if you have any comments or questions, fire them my way and I will address them. So good night all, and we'll see you soon.